The forgotten battlefield. Elena stood on the bridge of her small ship, staring at the flickering message on her screen. It was an old human distress signal, one that shouldn't exist anymore. The name Captain Reynolds flashed alongside the message. It sent a chill down her spine. Captain Reynolds was more than just a name to her. He was a hero, a savior. Years ago, when her homeworld was under attack, he had saved her life. He had fought alongside her people when no one else would. But after the war, he vanished, presumed dead. Now, after all these years, his name had resurfaced like a ghost from the past. "This can't be real," she muttered, her fingers trembling as she replayed the signal. It was weak, broken, as if it had traveled through centuries. The source of the transmission was even stranger. An abandoned outpost on the far edge of known space. That sector had been a battlefield long ago, a graveyard of soldiers and ships. No one went there anymore. But Elena couldn't ignore the message. If there was even the slightest chance Reynolds was alive, she had to find out. He had risked everything for her once. Now it was her turn. "Set course for the outpost," she commanded, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. The ship's AI chirped in response, and the engines roared to life. The stars outside blurred into streaks of light as the ship jumped into hyperspace. Elena leaned back in her seat, memories of the war flooding her mind. She had been just a teenager when the war broke out. Her planet was a peaceful one, unprepared for the sudden invasion by a ruthless alien empire. The humans had been their unlikely allies, fighting with ferocity that shocked even the invaders. And among the human soldiers, none were more fearless than Captain Reynolds. He had been a force of nature on the battlefield, always leading from the front, always protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. When her village had been overrun, Reynolds had been the one to carry her to safety. She could still remember the determined look in his eyes, the way he refused to let her fall. And now, after all this time, his name was calling to her from the darkness. The journey to the outpost felt endless. When her ship finally dropped out of hyperspace, the sight before her made her heart sink. The outpost was in ruins, a shattered husk floating among the wreckage of old ships. The battlefield around it was eerily silent, the debris of war frozen in time. It was a graveyard of steel and death. Elena piloted her ship closer, docking at the crumbling station. The airlock creaked open, and she stepped inside, her boots echoing in the empty corridors. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of decay. Scorch marks lined the walls, and scattered debris hinted at a desperate last stand. "Hello," she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. Only silence answered her. She activated her wrist scanner, searching for any signs of life. The readings were faint, almost non-existent. It was as if the outpost itself was barely alive, clinging to existence. Yet, something felt wrong. The atmosphere was too quiet, too still, as if the shadows were watching her. Moving deeper into the station, Elena found a control room. The consoles were ancient, their screens cracked and covered in dust. She brushed them off, her fingers leaving trails in the grime. When she powered up the system, it flickered weakly to life. The distress signal played again, but this time, it was accompanied by fragments of data, logs, coordinates, and fragments of a mission report. Her heart raced as she scrolled through them. They spoke of a secret mission, one Reynolds had undertaken after the war. The details were vague, but one thing was clear: he had been chasing something dangerous. Before she could read more, a sound behind her made her freeze, a soft clink, like metal on metal. She spun around, her hand reaching for the small plasma pistol at her side. But there was nothing there, only the empty corridor. "Get a grip," she told herself, shaking her head. "It's just an old station." But the unease wouldn't leave her. As she turned back to the console, a shadow passed across the screen. She spun around again, her pistol raised. The corridor was still empty. Her scanner beeped, drawing her attention. A new reading had appeared, faint but real. It was coming from deeper inside the station. Taking a deep breath, Alina followed the signal, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The corridor twisted and turned, leading her into the heart of the outpost. The shadows seemed to grow darker, heavier, as if they were pressing in on her. Finally, she reached a sealed door. The scanner indicated the signal was coming from the other side. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the controls. Whatever was behind that door, it wasn't going to be ordinary. Steeling herself, she pressed the button. The door groaned open, revealing a dark chamber. At the center, a single console glowed faintly, its light casting eerie shadows across the room. And on the floor, half buried in debris, was a battered human helmet. Alina's breath caught in her throat. She picked up the helmet, her hands trembling. The name etched on the side was barely legible, but she could still read it. Reynolds. Before she could process what she had found, the console crackled to life. A distorted voice whispered through the speakers, chilling her to the bone. "Alina, I've been waiting." Her heart pounded as the lights in the chamber flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. Ghosts of the past. Alina's footsteps echoed louder than they should have in the empty corridors. The outpost was a husk, forgotten by time. Yet it felt as if the shadows themselves were watching her. The air was thick with something she couldn't quite name, like the weight of memories pressing down on her. She glanced at the dog tag in her palm. Reynolds, C. It felt too real to be a coincidence. The man who had once saved her life was tied to this place. But was he still alive? Or was she chasing ghosts? Her wrist scanner flickered with faint traces of energy deeper in the station. It wasn't life, but it wasn't nothing either. Alina followed the signal, weaving through narrow corridors lined with rusted pipes and flickering lights. The deeper she went, the colder it seemed to get. At the far end of a passage, she found a door that barely held itself together. Scratches lined its surface, as if something had tried to claw its way inside or out. Her gut twisted. She reached out, pressing her palm to the access panel. The door shuddered open with a groan, revealing a control room bathed in pale blue light. Consoles sat dormant, their screens flickering with static. In the center of the room, a large glass window stretched from floor to ceiling, overlooking the wreckage of old starships drifting in space. The view was haunting, a graveyard without headstones. As Alina stepped inside, the door slid shut behind her. The sound felt final. She approached the main console and brushed off the dust. The screen responded to her touch, revealing a series of encrypted files. A file marked classified, Reynolds, flashed briefly before disappearing into corrupted code. Alina frowned and tapped at the controls, but no matter what she tried, the system refused to cooperate. Then, the room changed. A flicker at the edge of her vision. Movement. Alina's head snapped up, eyes scanning the glass window. At first, she thought it was a reflection. But the shape standing behind her wasn't hers. It was faint, barely there. A figure in old human military armor, helmet tucked under one arm. The outline shimmered, as if the figure were caught between reality and something else. "Reynolds." Alina whispered, but as soon as she spoke, the figure was gone. The console flickered violently, and the speakers crackled with static. Then a voice, distorted but unmistakable. "Leave this place. It's not safe." Alina's breath hitched. It was his voice. Older, worn, but it was him. She leaned in closer. "Captain Reynolds. Where are you? What happened here?" The voice didn't respond right away. The static thickened, swallowing the silence like a living thing. "You shouldn't have come." The lights overhead sputtered, casting long, warped shadows across the room. Alina's pulse quickened. "I'm not leaving," she said firmly. "Not until I find you." The static cut off abruptly. For a moment, the room felt deathly still. Alina held her breath, waiting. Suddenly, the glass window in front of her darkened, as if something enormous had passed between the station and the stars. Alina stepped back, But before she could process what was happening, the console in front of her lit up again, this time with coordinates. They pointed to a distant, uncharted planet. A single word appeared beneath them: Haven. Alina narrowed her eyes. The name wasn't familiar, but she knew one thing. If Reynolds had left this trail behind, it was meant for her to follow. Without hesitation, she downloaded the coordinates to her wrist scanner and turned to leave. But as she stepped toward the door, the lights flickered again. This time, when the shadows moved, she was certain they weren't hers. "You said, the Lost Soldier's Trail." The planet loomed like a scar against the backdrop of space, silent, gray, and shrouded in storms. Alina's ship trembled as it pierced through the thick atmosphere, lightning crackling along the hull. The coordinates Reynolds left behind had led her here, to this desolate world on the far edge of known space. But as her ship descended, she felt it. The weight. It wasn't gravity. It was something else, something unseen pressing down on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. Her scanner showed no signs of life, not even the faint hum of wildlife. It was as if the entire planet held its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. Alina landed near the ruins of what once might have been an outpost, now little more than crumbling walls and twisted metal. She stepped onto the cracked earth, the wind howling around her, carrying whispers that didn't belong to the wind. She ignored them. The signal had led her here, and she wasn't leaving without answers. The ruins stretched out before her, silent and lifeless, but scattered among the debris were traces of human technology, too advanced for this place. A fragment of a helmet, the corner of a military datapad, and the unmistakable imprint of boots in the dirt. Human boots. Alina knelt, running her fingers over the footprints. They were fresh. "He's here," she muttered. Her wrist scanner beeped softly, detecting a faint energy signature deeper within the ruins. Alina followed it, weaving through narrow alleyways formed by the collapsed structures. Every corner felt like a trap, every shadow a set of watching eyes. Then she saw it. A small structure stood at the heart of the ruins, untouched by the decay around it. Its surface was smooth, metallic, and humming faintly with power. This wasn't part of the original outpost. It was something newer, human-made. Alina approached cautiously, raising her weapon. The door slid open without a sound, and she stepped inside. The interior was dim, but a soft glow emanated from consoles lining the walls. Alina's eyes locked onto a hologram flickering at the center of the room. It was Reynolds. Or at least, what was left of him. The image was grainy, distorted by time and damage, but his face was unmistakable. His hair had grayed, and his eyes held the weight of someone who had seen too much. "If you found this," the recording stuttered, "then I'm either gone, or worse." Alina swallowed, stepping closer to the hologram. "The war never ended, not for me. There's something out there, something we weren't meant to see. I followed it here, but I don't think I can stop it alone." The message cut out abruptly, replaced by static. Alina clenched her fists. "Damn it, Reynolds, what did you get yourself into?" Before she could react, a new sound filled the room. Footsteps. Real ones. Alina spun around, weapon raised. In the doorway stood a figure clad in battle-worn human armor, helmet tucked under one arm. His eyes locked with hers, sharp but tired. "Reynolds," Alina whispered in disbelief. But something was different. The man standing before her wasn't the same as the one she remembered. His movements were slower, heavier, and there was a faint, unnatural glow in his eyes. "You shouldn't have come," Reynolds said, his voice quiet but firm. "This place changes people, and not for the better." Alina lowered her weapon, staring at him. "You're alive." "For now," he replied, glancing over his shoulder. "But I don't know how long that's going to last." "What happened here?" Alina demanded, stepping closer. "That message, what were you trying to stop?" Reynolds' expression darkened. He took a long breath before answering. "There's something buried here, beneath the surface. something that should have stayed buried. Elena's gaze narrowed. And now? Reynolds met her eyes, the glow in his irises flickering like distant stars. Now it's waking up. Contact from the void. The outpost was dead, but the air was alive with whispers. Elena stood at the edge of the observation deck, staring out at the storm-racked planet below. Reynolds sat in silence beside her, his eyes distant, fixed on something she couldn't see. "I heard your voice," she said, breaking the quiet. "Before I found you. It led me here." Reynolds didn't look at her. His fingers drummed lightly against his knee. "That wasn't me." Elena's stomach twisted. She remembered the distorted voice over the outpost's comm system, the one that had whispered her name. If it wasn't you, who was it? Reynolds finally met her gaze. His eyes glowed faintly, unnatural and cold. Something else. Before she could press further, the lights overhead flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When the power returned, Elena's wrist scanner buzzed with new activity. A signal, strong, fresh, and coming from the planet's surface. "That wasn't there before," she muttered, tapping the screen. Reynolds rose to his feet, his movements deliberate. "It's been there the whole time. You just couldn't see it until now." Elena frowned. "What do you mean?" He grabbed his rifle, slinging it over his shoulder. "Because now it knows you're here." The planet's surface was worse than it had looked from orbit. The wind screamed through jagged canyons, and strange, twisted shapes jutted from the ground, like bones left behind by something massive. Elena's boots crunched against the cracked ground as she followed Reynolds across the desolate landscape. The signal led them toward a series of ruins that stretched toward the horizon, half buried beneath sand and ash. "Whatever's down here, it's been waiting a long time," Reynolds said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "This planet wasn't always like this." Elena glanced at him. "You've been here before, haven't you?" Reynolds didn't answer immediately. His eyes traced the ruins as if piecing together fragments of an old memory. "Not by choice," he said finally. They reached the center of the ruins, where a massive stone arch stood alone, weathered but untouched by time. Strange carvings spiraled along its surface, glowing faintly as they approached. Elena's wrist scanner beeped erratically. The signal was coming from just beyond the archway. "What is this place?" she asked, stepping closer. Reynolds' grip on his weapon tightened. A door. Before Elena could ask to where, the ground beneath the arch shimmered. Just for a second. A figure appeared on the other side. Her heart nearly stopped. It was her. Or at least, a version of her. The figure standing beyond the arch looked exactly like her, but wrong. Her features were distorted, her eyes empty, and her reflection flickered like a broken hologram. Elena took a step back, her pulse racing. "What the hell is that?" Reynolds didn't move. His voice was calm, but grim. "It's not you." The figure mirrored Elena's every move, its head tilting as if studying her. The glow of the carvings grew brighter, casting long shadows across the ruins. Reynolds raised his rifle. "Don't let it touch you." The figure stepped forward, crossing the threshold of the arch. Its form shimmered and twisted, growing more solid with each step. "Move," Reynolds barked. Elena sprinted back, her heart pounding as the figure lunged toward her, its face shifting and distorting with every flicker of light. Reynolds fired, the blast tearing through the creature. It dissolved into shadow, vanishing into the wind. Elena caught her breath, staring at the spot where the figure had been. "What was that?" she gasped. Reynolds lowered his weapon, his expression hard. "This planet reflects what it sees. It creates copies, echoes, of anything that enters. But the copies, they're not perfect. And they never stop hunting the originals." Elena's mind reeled. "How do you know all this?" Reynolds' eyes flickered with that same faint glow. "Because I've been running from mine for years." The wind howled louder, as if the planet itself was waking up. In the distance, dark figures began to emerge from the ruins, dozens of them. All of them wearing Reynolds' face. The planet of shadows. The storm had quieted, but the silence that followed was worse. Elena stepped carefully over the jagged stones, her gaze locked on the horizon, where the ruins stretched endlessly. Behind her, Reynolds moved like a shadow, his eyes never lingering too long on any one place. The planet felt wrong. Not dangerous in the way of hostile worlds. There were no creatures lurking, no visible threats. But it was the absence that gnawed at Elena's thoughts. No life, no sound, as if the entire planet had forgotten how to breathe. "This place wasn't built by your people," Elena said, breaking the quiet. Her voice sounded smaller than she expected, swallowed by the heavy air. "No," Reynolds replied. His eyes scanned the distant structures, lingering on the tallest one. A tower half buried in sand, its surface worn smooth by centuries of wind. "It's older. Much older." Elena adjusted her scanner, trying to lock onto the signal they'd been following. "The source is there," she said, nodding toward the tower. "You think whatever you were chasing is inside." Reynolds' jaw tightened. "I don't think it ever left." The tower was taller than it looked. The closer they got, the more Elena felt the weight of it, like the structure itself was leaning down to watch them approach. The carvings on its surface twisted and shifted when she wasn't looking directly at them. The entrance was a narrow archway, half collapsed, barely wide enough for them to squeeze through. Reynolds entered first, weapon drawn. Elena followed, her fingers lightly brushing the stone as she passed. Inside, the temperature dropped sharply. The walls were smooth, not carved but shaped, melted into unnatural curves. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, disappearing into shadows. Elena checked her scanner again. "The signal's stronger here. We're close." Reynolds didn't respond. His eyes were locked on something ahead. At the far end of the hallway, a faint light pulsed. It wasn't warm or inviting. If anything, it felt colder. Elena could feel it pulling at the edges of her thoughts, as if the light itself was aware of them. Reynolds moved forward without hesitation. Elena followed, her footsteps soft against the stone floor. When they reached the source of the light, Elena's breath caught. A chamber stretched out before them, impossibly large, far bigger than the tower should have been able to contain. At the center, something was suspended in midair, a single jagged shard of black crystal, spinning slowly. Elena stepped closer. "Is that it?" she whispered. Reynolds' voice was flat. "No, that's the lock." Her eyes narrowed. "Lock? For what?" Before Reynolds could answer, the chamber shifted. The shadows that had been clinging to the corners began to ripple, stretching toward the crystal. Elena's heart pounded as shapes emerged from the darkness. Tall, humanoid figures, but twisted. Their forms shimmered like smoke, flickering in and out of reality. She instinctively raised her weapon. "Reynolds." "I know," he said calmly, leveling his rifle at the approaching figures. "Don't let them touch you." The shadows moved faster, converging on them in eerie silence. Reynolds fired first, his shots tearing through the nearest figure. It dissolved, but two more appeared in its place. Elena opened fire, but her blasts passed right through the shadows. "They're not real," she shouted. "They don't have to be real to kill you," Reynolds replied. The figures closed in, their empty faces reflecting hers. For a brief moment, Elena saw her own shadow reaching for her, long, thin fingers stretching out from the floor beneath her feet. Reynolds shoved her aside as the shadow lashed forward, narrowly missing her. "We have to break the lock," he said, breathing hard. Elena's eyes flicked to the floating crystal. "How?" Reynolds stepped toward it, raising a small metallic device from his belt. "You're not going to like it." Before she could ask what he meant, Reynolds pressed the device to the crystal. A sharp, high-pitched sound filled the chamber. The crystal cracked. The shadows screamed. The chamber shook violently, the walls distorting like liquid. The figures dissolved, but their screams didn't stop. Elena stumbled, shielding her eyes from the light that erupted from the fractured crystal. When the light faded, the chamber was silent again. The crystal had shattered into dozens of pieces, each one pulsing faintly on the ground. Elena turned to Reynolds. "What did you just do?" He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Open the door." Elena's stomach dropped. "To what?" Reynolds looked past her, toward the now empty air where the crystal had once floated. "To whatever's been waiting. The soldier who wouldn't die." The sky above Haven twisted unnaturally, as if the stars were folding in on themselves. Elena watched the swirling clouds, her breath visible in the freezing air. Reynolds stood beside her, silent and still, his gaze fixed on the horizon. They had broken the crystal, shattered the lock that had sealed this place, but now the world felt heavier, as if something unseen had slipped free. "You said this was a door," Elena said quietly. "What exactly did we let out?" Reynolds finally looked at her, the faint glow in his eyes flickering like dying embers. "I thought I could stop it before. I was wrong." "That's not an answer." He exhaled slowly, his hand tightening around his rifle. "I don't think it ever left. It's been here, watching, waiting for someone to notice. Breaking the crystal didn't release it. It just woke it up." Elena's heart sank. She turned back toward the ruins below, where the shadows stretched unnaturally across the ground. "What is it, Reynolds?" For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, he whispered, "A reflection." Elena frowned. "A reflection of what?" "Us," Reynolds replied, his voice distant. "Or at least, what we could become." The path leading down into the ruins felt longer this time. The silence between them was thick, but Elena didn't press him for answers. She could see it, the exhaustion hanging over him like a weight he had been carrying alone for far too long. As they approached the outpost, Elena's scanner beeped softly. Faint life signs flickered on the display. "Life signs," she muttered, lowering the scanner. "That can't be right. This place is deserted." Reynolds didn't stop walking. "It's not wrong. I've seen them before." Elena quickened her pace to match his. "You mean there are survivors?" He shook his head. "No, there aren't." They reached the entrance of the main structure. Reynolds pushed the heavy door open, and the two stepped inside. The air was colder here, thick with dust and stale memories. Elena froze. There, standing in the middle of the room, was Reynolds. Or rather, something that looked like him. The figure wore the same armor, bore the same scars, but there was no life in its eyes. It stood perfectly still, like a statue that had just been carved. Elena instinctively raised her weapon. "Reynolds." "What is that?" Reynolds didn't flinch. "I told you." A reflection. Her hand shook slightly as she kept the gun trained on the figure. "Why is it just standing there?" "Because it's waiting," Reynolds replied calmly. "For what?" "For me." Elena's grip on the weapon tightened. The figure's eyes shifted ever so slightly, locking onto Reynolds. "It doesn't want to kill me," Reynolds said, his tone cold. "It wants to replace me." "That's what they do. They watch, they learn, and when you're at your weakest." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Elena's voice lowered. "How long have you been running from it?" Reynolds took a slow step forward, never breaking eye contact with the figure. "Too long." The figure mirrored his movement, matching him step for step. Elena swallowed. "How do we stop it?" Reynolds smirked faintly. "You can't stop something that's already inside you." Before Elena could react, the figure lunged forward. Reynolds moved faster. In one fluid motion, he swung his rifle, striking the figure's head with the butt of his weapon. The blow landed with a sickening crack, and the figure stumbled, flickering like static. "Run," Reynolds shouted. Elena didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward the exit, but as she neared the door, another figure stepped into view, her reflection. The figure's eyes were hollow, its face eerily calm. Elena's heart raced. "Reynolds," she shouted, raising her pistol. The reflection tilted its head, mirroring her every movement. Reynolds appeared beside her, dragging her toward the door. Don't look at it too long, he warned. The more you look, the more it becomes you. They burst through the entrance, leaving the figures behind. Elena's pulse pounded in her ears as she stumbled to a stop outside. Reynolds exhaled, glancing over his shoulder. It's getting stronger. Elena caught her breath, watching the door behind them slowly creak shut. How do we stop this, Reynolds? For the first time since she found him, Reynolds looked uncertain. I don't know if we can. The final stand. The stars above Haven began to vanish, one by one. Elena watched in silence as the sky folded into darkness, the last remnants of light swallowed by something vast and unseen. The air itself felt thinner, like the planet was holding its breath. Reynolds stood beside her, rifle in hand, staring out at the horizon. The ruins below stretched endlessly, and in the fading light, figures moved, reflections of them both, flickering like distorted memories. They're coming, Elena said quietly. Reynolds didn't respond. His eyes glowed faintly in the dark, a reminder that whatever had changed him had left its mark. They don't stop, do they? Elena asked, gripping her sidearm. No, Reynolds replied. They don't. The first shadow stepped from the ruins. It wasn't just a reflection this time. It was something worse, taller, more twisted, as if it had grown stronger by feeding on their fear. Its face was vaguely human, but its eyes were empty. Reynolds raised his weapon. It's not afraid of us anymore. Elena aimed at the creature's head, her hand steady despite the pounding in her chest. Then we give it a reason to be. The creature lunged. Reynolds fired first, his shot tearing through the figure's chest. But instead of falling, it flickered and reformed, shifting closer with unnatural speed. Elena's shot followed, aimed directly at its head. This time, the figure stumbled, its form dissolving for a brief moment before solidifying again. They're learning, Reynolds muttered, stepping back as more figures emerged from the ruins. Elena's eyes darted around them. There's too many. Reynolds lowered his rifle. We're not supposed to fight them all. She shot him a sharp glance. Then what do we do? He pointed toward the tallest ruin in the distance, the tower where they had shattered the crystal. We end it where it began. They moved quickly, weaving through the ruins as the shadows closed in behind them. The wind howled, carrying faint whispers that clawed at Elena's mind. The figures never strayed far, but they didn't attack. Not yet. They're waiting for us to fall apart, Reynolds said, keeping his eyes forward. That's how they win. Elena forced herself to stay focused, but the weight of the planet pressed down harder with each step. At the base of the tower, the entrance was already open, the chamber within pulsing faintly with the remnants of the shattered crystal. Reynolds paused. This is where I lost myself the first time. Elena hesitated. You're not lost, Reynolds. He smiled faintly, but the light in his eyes dimmed. Maybe not yet. Inside the chamber, the shards of the crystal still lay scattered across the floor, but something else waited for them. A figure stood at the far end of the room. It was Reynolds, fully formed, wearing pristine armor that looked untouched by war. His reflection stepped forward, moving like it had been waiting for this moment. Elena tensed. This is it, isn't it? Reynolds nodded. One of us isn't walking out of here. The reflection's eyes locked onto Reynolds, and for the first time, it spoke. Its voice was smooth, calm, a perfect mirror of his own. You've been running long enough, it said. Reynolds gripped his rifle, but he didn't raise it. I'm not running anymore. The reflection smiled faintly. Neither am I. The room darkened. The shadows around them merged into the reflection, giving it shape, weight, something real. Elena took a step forward. You're not him. The reflection's gaze shifted to her. No, but I could be. Reynolds raised his weapon. You'll never be. The shot echoed through the chamber, but the reflection didn't fall. It caught the bullet midair, holding it between its fingers as if time itself had slowed. I know every move you'll make, the reflection said. Because I am you. Reynolds' jaw tightened. Then you know how this ends. Before the reflection could react, Alina fired, not at the figure, but at the shards of the crystal on the floor. The crystal erupted in light. The reflection's form flickered violently, twisting and distorting as if the light itself was tearing it apart. Reynolds stepped forward, plunging his rifle directly into the reflection's chest. The figure's eyes widened, not with pain, but with understanding. You never wanted to win. The reflection whispered as its form dissolved into ash. You just wanted to be free. Reynolds watched as the last remnants of his reflection faded, leaving only silence behind. Alina lowered her weapon. Is it over? Reynolds stared at the shattered crystal, his glowing eyes dimming as the light faded from the chamber. For now, he said quietly. Outside, the stars slowly returned to the sky. Alina and Reynolds stood at the edge of the ruins, watching as the planet began to breathe again. The shadows were gone, leaving only the cold wind and the distant hum of the outpost. Reynolds glanced at her. You didn't have to follow me this far. Alina smirked. Someone has to make sure you don't run off again. Reynolds laughed softly. For the first time, his eyes looked normal. As they walked back toward the ship, Alina glanced at him. So what happens now? Reynolds looked up at the stars. Now, he took a long breath. Now, we keep moving. Together.